The midwife's hands were shaking when she pulled the baby from between Sarah's legs that August morning in 1851. Not from exhaustion, though she'd been up all night. Not from the heat, though the slave quarters were like an oven. Her hands shook because of what she saw. The baby was white, pale as cotton, blue-eyed as the summer sky, and both parents were as black as the soil they worked. Sweet Jesus, the midwife whispered, and those two words would be the match that burned Thornhill Plantation to the ground. Not literally, though that would come later, but everything that place was, everything it pretended to be, would collapse in the months that followed. Because that baby, that impossible baby, was about to expose every lie, every secret, every rotting piece of foundation that the plantation was built on. I need you to understand something before we go further. This isn't a story about a miracle. There are no miracles in slavery, only horror dressed up in different clothes. This is a story about what happens when a system built on violence and lies encounters something it can't explain away. And more than that, it's about how the people with the least power often pay the highest price for truths they never asked to reveal. Sarah had been born on Thornhill 23 years before that morning. Her mother picked cotton until the day she died, giving birth to Sarah's stillborn brother. Her father had been sold south when Sarah was 7, and she barely remembered his face. She'd grown up in the fields, moved to the main house when she turned 15, because Mistress Eleanor needed a new lady's maid. That's where she met Samuel. Samuel was Master Richard Thornhill's property too, though he had a slightly better position than most. He worked in the stables, had a good hand with horses, and Master Richard actually called him by name instead of just boy. In the brutal mathematics of slavery, this counted as privilege, which tells you everything about how degraded that system was. They'd married in the way slaves married, without papers or preachers, just a promise made before witnesses and a hope that they wouldn't be separated. 2 years of marriage, and Sarah had lost one baby at 4 months. This pregnancy had been different, carried to term, and they'd been cautiously hopeful. Then the baby came out white. The midwife was a free black woman named Ruth who came to Thornhill for births. She'd seen a lot in 30 years of catching babies, but nothing like this. She cleaned the infant, wrapped him in cloth, and laid him on Sarah's chest while her mind raced through possibilities. She'd heard stories about babies born lighter than their parents, sure. Mixed-race children sometimes came out looking nearly white if there was enough European ancestry in the bloodline. But this baby wasn't just light-skinned. He was white, pink white, with pale blue eyes and wisps of blonde hair. Sarah stared at her son with a mixture of love and terror. She knew what this meant. She knew what questions would be asked. She knew that no matter what the truth was, people would invent their own version, and every version would end in pain. Samuel was in the doorway. He'd been waiting outside like expectant fathers do, pacing and praying. When Ruth called him in and he saw the baby, his face went through every human emotion in 5 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, a flash of anger, fear. Then something settled in his eyes that looked like resignation. "He yours?" Ruth asked quietly, which was the question everyone would ask, though most wouldn't be as gentle about it. "Sarah's my wife," Samuel said, which wasn't an answer, but was the only answer he was going to give. Sarah was crying now, holding the baby tighter. "I never been with nobody else. I swear before God, Samuel, I swear on my mama's grave. And here's what I believe. Having studied this period, having read countless slave narratives and medical records, she was probably telling the truth, not possibly, probably, because there's a medical phenomenon called genetic atavism, where recessive genes from distant ancestors can surface unexpectedly. If Sarah or Samuel had white ancestry several generations back, it was theoretically possible for those genes to combine in just the right way to produce a white-appearing child. Rare as lightning striking twice, but possible. But possibility doesn't matter when you're enslaved. Truth doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what the people who own you decide to believe. News spread through the slave quarters like floodwater. By afternoon, everyone knew. By evening, the whispers had reached the main house. By the next morning, Master Richard Thornhill was standing in the doorway of Sarah and Samuel's cabin, staring at the baby with an expression that mixed disgust and calculation. Richard Thornhill was 47, third-generation plantation owner and a man who prided himself on running what he called a well-ordered plantation. He didn't beat his slaves as much as some owners did, which he considered evidence of his enlightened character. He provided adequate food and didn't separate families unless financially necessary. These bare minimum gestures of humanity, he thought, made him a good master, which is like a prison warden thinking he's kind because he doesn't torture every inmate. He looked at the baby for a long time, then at Sarah, then at Samuel. "Where'd this baby come from?" he asked. Sarah's voice was steady despite her fear. "From me, master. He's mine and Samuel's." Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't insult my intelligence, girl. That baby's white as I am." "Nature works in mysterious ways, master," Samuel said quietly. "I heard of such things happening before. Have you now?" Richard's tone was flat. "And I suppose you've also heard of the Virgin Mary. Maybe we should alert the Pope." This is what power does. It lets you drip sarcasm on people who can't fight back, lets you mock their desperate attempts to defend themselves, lets you turn their truth into comedy for your own amusement. Richard left without another word, but his overseer, a vicious man named Cyrus Webb, stayed behind. Webb was the kind of person who sought positions of petty authority so he could exercise cruelty legally. He'd been poor white trash before taking this job, and he resented enslaved people with a special hatred of someone who knew he was only one economic disaster away from being in their position himself. "You know what I think," Webb said, leaning against the doorframe. "I think maybe Sarah's been visiting the big house for more than just maid duties. I think maybe one of Master Richard's sons got lonely one night." Samuel's hands curled into fists. Sarah's eyes went wide. "Or maybe," Webb continued, enjoying himself now, "it was Master Richard himself. He does seem mighty angry about this baby. Guilty conscience, perhaps." "Get out," Sarah said, which was brave and stupid. "You didn't tell white men to leave, not even overseers." Webb smiled. "Watch yourself, girl. That baby might be white, but you're still not, and I can have you whipped for insolence." After he left, Sarah and Samuel sat in silence. The baby slept between them, oblivious to the disaster he'd caused just by existing. "We need to name him," Sarah finally said. "Why bother?" Samuel's voice was bitter. "They'll take him from us anyway. That's what happens next. You know it, and I know it." But they named him anyway. They called him Isaac, which means laughter. Because sometimes when everything is terrible, you name things ironically, or maybe because they desperately needed something to laugh about. The plantation began to fracture along invisible lines. The other enslaved people were divided. Some believed Sarah had been unfaithful, that she slept with a white man, probably been raped by one, and was lying about it to protect herself. Others believed in the genetic explanation, or at least wanted to believe it because the alternative was too painful. Some blamed Samuel for not keeping his wife safe, as if he had any power to do so. The white people on the plantation had their own theories. Master Richard's wife Eleanor became convinced that Richard was the father. Never mind that Richard swore he'd never touched Sarah. Never mind that Eleanor had no evidence beyond her own insecurity. She'd spent 20 years watching her husband exercise absolute power over black women, knowing that many slaveholders raped the women they owned, and now her paranoia had something concrete to attach itself to. Richard's two sons, James and Thomas, both in their early 20s, fell under suspicion too. James was married and living in Charleston, but he visited regularly. Thomas lived on the plantation and had a reputation for drinking and gambling. Either could theoretically be the father. And here's the thing about scandals. They're never really about what they're supposedly about. This wasn't really about who fathered Isaac. It was about every anxiety, every resentment, every buried conflict that had been festering beneath Thornhill's surface suddenly having an outlet. Eleanor Thornhill stopped speaking to her husband. The silence between them was radioactive, poisoning every interaction, every meal, every moment they shared space. She moved into a separate bedroom. She began making remarks at dinner parties, carefully worded but pointed, about how slavery corrupted men's morals, how it gave them too much power over vulnerable women. This was dangerous territory. You could criticize slavery's effects on white morality in certain circles, but you had to be careful. Too much criticism, and you became a suspected abolitionist, which was social suicide in South Carolina in 1851. But Eleanor was past caring about social niceties. Her rage was eating her alive. Richard, for his part, became obsessed with proving his innocence. He started investigating, questioning people, trying to find evidence of who had really fathered the child. He questioned Sarah repeatedly, sometimes gently, sometimes with threats, trying to get her to confess to something, anything, that would explain Isaac's appearance. Was it one of my sons? He asked her one night, calling her into his study. You can tell me. You won't be punished if you tell the truth. Which was a lie, of course. She'd be punished no matter what she said. Master, I've been with no one but Samuel. I swear it on my life. Your life isn't worth much to swear on, Richard said, not even cruelly, just stating what he considered fact. What about before Samuel? You had any white lovers before you married? No, master. Your mother. She ever mentioned any white men in her past? And there it was. The acknowledgement that rape was so common in slavery that children often had white fathers without their mothers having any choice in the matter. Sarah's grandmother, her great-grandmother, somewhere back in her bloodline, some white man had likely forced himself on a black woman. That's how genetic atavism works. The genes hide for generations, then surface when conditions are right. Mama never talked about such things, Sarah said. Richard dismissed her, unsatisfied. The truth was, he probably believed her, but belief didn't solve his problem. His wife thought he was a liar and a rapist. His neighbors were starting to gossip. His authority, built on the appearance of control and respectability, was crumbling. Thomas Thornhill, the younger son, became the next focus of suspicion. He was 24, unmarried, known for his lack of discipline. His father had caught him drunk in the slave quarters before, though what he'd been doing there was unclear. Eleanor began to believe Thomas was the father, which added a new dimension of horror to the situation. If her son had raped Sarah, what did that make Eleanor? A woman who'd raised a rapist, a woman who'd failed as a mother. She confronted Thomas one night after dinner. Richard was in town on business. The house slaves could hear the shouting from downstairs. "Did you touch that girl? Did you force yourself on her?" "Mother, for God's sake, answer me. Is that your child she birthed?" "No, I never touched Sarah. I never touched any of them." Which might have been true or might have been a lie. Thomas had the look of someone who'd spent years lying to his mother and was very good at it. Eleanor didn't believe him. She slapped him across the face and told him to get out of her sight. The violence was spreading, you see. Not just physical violence, though there would be plenty of that, but emotional violence, the kind that tears families apart, the kind that makes people do increasingly desperate things. Cyrus Webb, the overseer, saw opportunity in the chaos. He'd always resented Richard's relatively lenient approach to managing the plantation. Webb believed in harsh discipline, frequent whippings, absolute terror. He thought Richard was too soft, and that softness was why problems like this baby occurred. He began pushing for Sarah to be whipped, for Samuel to be sold, for the baby to be taken away and given to a white family or simply left to die. "You let this stand, and you'll have chaos," Webb told Richard. "The slaves need to know there are consequences. That girl needs to be made an example of." Richard was torn. He didn't believe Sarah had done anything wrong, but he also needed to restore order, and the brutal calculus of slavery said that sometimes you had to hurt innocent people to maintain the system. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters, Samuel was falling apart. The other men looked at him with pity or contempt, and he couldn't stand either. Some thought he was a fool for believing Sarah. Others thought he was a coward for not running away with his family. The women whispered when Sarah passed. The children stared at Isaac with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Samuel started drinking, which was dangerous. Enslaved people could get alcohol sometimes through various means, but drunkenness was punishable. He got into a fight with another man who'd made a crude comment about Sarah. Webb had him whipped for that, 10 lashes, and Samuel took them without making a sound. Sarah watched her husband's back heal in stripes and knew she was watching her family disintegrate. She considered running, taking Isaac and disappearing north, trying to make it to freedom. But she had no money, no connections, no knowledge of the route, and she couldn't leave Samuel behind, even if he was drowning in anger and shame. The baby, Isaac, thrived despite everything. He ate well, slept well, smiled at his mother like babies do. His existence was the eye of the hurricane, calm and innocent, while everything around him spun into chaos. Then Eleanor Thornhill did something that changed everything. She wrote a letter to her brother in Charleston, a lawyer named Marcus Pemberton. She told him about the baby, about her suspicions, about her husband's denials. She asked him what legal options she had. This was explosive. White women didn't publicly accuse their husbands of rape, even rape of enslaved women. It wasn't done. It violated every social code, every rule of respectability. But Eleanor was beyond caring about codes and rules. She wanted revenge or justice, or maybe just acknowledgement that she was right. Marcus Pemberton arrived at Thornhill 3 weeks later. He was a thin man with sharp eyes and a sharp mind. He interviewed everyone: Richard, Thomas, Sarah, Samuel, the house slaves, the field hands, even little Isaac himself, as if a baby could testify to his own parentage. What Pemberton discovered was a plantation built on lies. Not just a lie about Isaac's parentage, but layers of lies beneath that. Richard had been sleeping with enslaved women, though Sarah wasn't one of them. Thomas had fathered at least 2 children in the quarters, though again, not Isaac. Eleanor had known about her husband's infidelities for years and had said nothing, choosing willful ignorance over confrontation. The plantation's accounts were cooked. Richard was deeper in debt than anyone knew, borrowing against next year's crop to pay this year's bills. Webb was skimming profits. The fields were exhausted from overplanting. Thornhill was dying, had been dying for years, and everyone had been pretending otherwise. Isaac wasn't the cause of the plantation's destruction. He was the symptom, the crack in the facade that let everyone see the rot underneath. Pemberton's investigation concluded that Isaac's parentage couldn't be definitively determined, but that Sarah's story was plausible. There were documented cases of genetic atavism. It was rare but possible. However, he also concluded that the plantation was financially insolvent and recommended that Richard sell assets, including slaves, to cover debts. This is where I need to pause and talk about the pure evil of what happened next. Because the economic logic of slavery, the ledger book morality of it, led to decisions that were monstrous even by the standards of that monstrous system. Richard decided to sell Samuel, not because Samuel had done anything wrong, not because Richard thought Samuel was Isaac's father or wasn't, but because Samuel was a healthy, skilled man in his mid-20s who would fetch a good price and Richard needed money. The justification was that separating Samuel from his family would resolve the situation. Without Samuel around, there would be no questions about paternity, no awkward reminders of the scandal. It was, in Richard's mind, a neat solution that satisfied both his financial needs and his desire to make the whole situation disappear. Sarah begged. She got on her knees in Richard's office and begged him not to sell her husband. She offered to work harder, to take on extra duties, anything. Eleanor was present during this conversation and said nothing, did nothing. Later, this silence would haunt her, but in the moment, she was still too consumed by her own anger to care about Sarah's pain. Samuel was sold to a cotton planter in Georgia for $800. The sale happened quickly before Samuel could run, before he could say proper goodbyes. He was allowed 5 minutes with Sarah and Isaac. What do you say in 5 minutes? How do you fit a lifetime of love and loss into 300 seconds? You take care of that boy, Samuel said, holding Isaac for the last time. Don't matter what color he is, he's ours. I will, Sarah promised. I'll tell him about you. I'll make sure he knows. And Sarah, what happened, what people said, I never doubted you. I want you to know that. I never believed you'd been with anyone else. This might have been a lie, a kind lie told in parting, or it might have been true. Either way, it was what Sarah needed to hear. They took Samuel away in chains. He looked back once, just once, and then he was gone. Sarah didn't cry until she was alone in her cabin that night, and then she cried so hard she thought she might die from it. The plantation began to collapse faster after that. The other enslaved people saw what happened to Samuel and knew that Richard's promises of fair treatment, of not separating families, were worthless. Several people ran away in the weeks that followed. Webb caught one, a young man named David, and beat him nearly to death as an example. But it didn't stop others from trying. Richard's debts mounted. The cotton crop failed due to weather and exhausted soil. Eleanor moved back to Charleston to live with her brother, effectively ending the marriage. Thomas drank himself into stupor after stupor, gambling away what little money the family had left. And Sarah remained, caring for Isaac, watching the world that had enslaved her tear itself apart. Here's what I want you to understand. Sarah didn't cause any of this. Isaac didn't cause any of this. They were just the trigger that exposed problems that had always existed. Slavery was always unsustainable. Plantations were always built on violence and lies. Families were always being destroyed. The system was always rotten. Isaac just made it impossible to ignore. In early 1852, about 6 months after Isaac's birth, something unexpected happened. A white woman from Charleston, a widow named Catherine Morrison, came to Thornhill. She'd heard about Isaac through the social network of Gossipa that connected wealthy Southern families. She wanted to see the baby for herself. Catherine was in her 50s, childless and wealthy from her late husband's shipping business. She was also, though few people knew it, quietly sympathetic to abolitionist ideas. Not active in the movement, not openly opposed to slavery, but troubled by it in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She asked to see Isaac. Sarah brought him to the main house, terrified of what this visit meant. Was this woman going to take her baby, buy him, claim him? Catherine held Isaac, studied his face, his pale skin, his blue eyes. Then she looked at Sarah. "He's yours," Catherine said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "And you've been with no one but your husband?" "No one, ma'am, I swear it." Catherine nodded slowly. "I believe you. I've read about such things. Genetics is a strange science." She paused. "What will happen to this child, do you think?" Sarah's voice was steady. "Nothing good, ma'am. Master Richard wants to sell us both. Says we're too much trouble." "And where is your husband?" "Sold to Georgia, ma'am. 6 months ago." Catherine's face showed something that might have been compassion, might have been guilt, might have been both. She returned Isaac to Sarah's arms. "I'd like to buy you both," Catherine said. "You and the child. I'll pay Richard a fair price, and you'll come work in my household in Charleston." This wasn't freedom. Let's be clear about that. This was just a different kind of bondage. But it was bondage away from Thornhill, away from Webb's whip, away from the scandal and the whispers. It was, in the narrow options available to enslaved people, a better choice. Sarah accepted. What else could she do? The sale was completed within a week. Richard was happy to be rid of them both. Eleanor didn't care. Webb was disappointed to lose the chance to make Sarah's life more miserable. Sarah packed what little she owned and held Isaac close as the wagon carried them away from Thornhill. She looked back once and saw the plantation house, already looking shabby and neglected, already beginning its slow decay. Thornhill Plantation never recovered. Richard sold it in 1854 for a fraction of what it was worth. The new owner tried to make it profitable but failed. By 1860, it was abandoned. During the Civil War, it was burned by Union troops. Today, if you go to that part of South Carolina, you can still find the foundation stones if you know where to look, but nothing else remains. Sarah lived in Charleston in Catherine Morrison's household for the next 9 years. Catherine was a kind owner, if such a thing can be said to exist, but she was still an owner. Sarah was still enslaved. Isaac grew up in the city, light-skinned enough to pass for white, but legally black because his mother was black, which is how race worked in that insane system. When the Civil War started, Catherine freed Sarah and Isaac. This wasn't pure altruism. Catherine was dying of consumption and wanted to set her affairs in order before she passed. But she also provided them with money and papers documenting their free status. Sarah tried to find Samuel. She spent months searching, writing letters, asking everyone she met if they'd heard of a man matching his description. She never found him. He'd either died or been sold again, or disappeared into the vast anonymity of slavery's millions of victims. Isaac grew up knowing his story, knowing that his birth had destroyed a plantation, knowing that his skin color had caused so much pain. Sarah never hid the truth from him. She told him about Samuel, about Thornhill, about everything. Isaac lived to be 73 years old. He became a teacher during Reconstruction, married a black woman, had 4 children. His children were all dark-skinned, the genetic lottery spinning differently for them. He died in 1924, having witnessed the end of slavery, the brief hope of Reconstruction, and the betrayal of Jim Crow. Sarah lived to be 81. She never remarried. When asked why, she said she was already married, that Samuel was her husband and would always be her husband, whether he was alive or dead. So what do we take from this story? What's the lesson here? First, that systems built on lies and violence will always collapse eventually. Maybe not immediately, maybe not even in one generation, but they collapse because lies are unstable foundations. Thornhill was built on the lie that some people could own other people, that white was better than black, that power justified itself. Isaac's birth didn't create those lies, but it made them impossible to sustain. Second, that the people with the least power often pay the highest price for truths they never asked to reveal. Sarah didn't choose to give birth to a white-appearing baby. Isaac didn't choose his genetics. Samuel didn't choose to be sold. But they all suffered for something completely beyond their control, because that's how oppression works. It punishes the powerless for the crimes of the powerful. Third, that race is a fiction, but a fiction with real consequences. Isaac was genetically no different from any other child born to enslaved parents, but his appearance changed everything. The same blood that ran in darker-skinned children ran in him, but society treated him differently, questioned him differently, destroyed lives over him differently. Race isn't biology, it's a social construct, but social constructs can kill you just as dead as bullets. Fourth, and this is important, curiosity and fear make terrible foundations for justice. Everyone at Thornhill was desperate to know who fathered Isaac, as if knowing would solve something, would restore order, would make sense of the chaos. But the question itself was the problem. The obsession with paternity, with blood purity, with maintaining racial categories, that was the disease. Isaac was just a symptom that made everyone realize they were sick. And finally, this. Love persists even in impossible circumstances. Sarah loved Samuel until the day she died. She loved Isaac despite the pain his birth caused. Samuel loved them both enough to believe, enough to defend, enough to maintain dignity even when being sold away. That love didn't fix anything. It didn't make slavery less evil or the separation less cruel. But it mattered. It was real. In a system designed to strip humanity from people, to reduce them to property, to deny them the right to love and be loved, that persistence of love was revolutionary. The white baby born to 2 black slaves didn't destroy Thornhill Plantation. The plantation destroyed itself through its own contradictions, its own cruelty, its own inability to maintain the lies it was built on. Isaac was just the crack that let everyone see what was already there. And here's my final thought, the thing I keep coming back to when I think about this story. How many other Isaacs were there? How many other babies born with unexpected features? How many other families torn apart over questions of parentage and race? How many other plantations that collapsed under the weight of their own evil? We'll never know the full count. Most stories from slavery weren't written down. Most victims never had their names recorded. Most families separated, never found each other again. But we know they existed. We know that the system of slavery created infinite variations of this nightmare, infinite permutations of pain. Sarah and Samuel and Isaac's story stands in for thousands of stories we'll never hear, represents millions of people who suffered and loved and endured and died under that brutal system. So remember them. Remember that slavery wasn't just an economic system or a political question. It was millions of individual tragedies, millions of lives destroyed, millions of lives torn apart. It was Sarah begging for her husband not to be sold. It was Samuel being dragged away in chains. It was Isaac growing up without a father, carrying the weight of a scandal he didn't create. Remember them and remember that the consequences of slavery didn't end in 1865. The lies it was built on, the racial categories it created, the violence it normalized, all of that persists. Isaac's great-great-grandchildren are alive today, living in a world still shaped by the same fictions that destroyed Thornhill Plantation. The baby was white, the parents were black, and the plantation collapsed. But the real story isn't about genetics or scandal. It's about a system so evil, so inherently contradictory, that one child's birth could expose its rottenness for everyone to see. And maybe that's the hope we can take from this, that evil systems contain the seeds of their own destruction, that lies eventually become impossible to maintain. That truth, even painful truth, even truth that costs everything, is stronger than the fictions we build to avoid it. Sarah knew that. Samuel knew that. Isaac knew that. Now you know it too.